like to thank SIETAR Europa for having me. Actually, the background story is I have been a member for quite some time, but I was a member from China, so I didn't experience this organization in person. And it was this summer, actually late spring, early summer, at the Malta conference that I found out personally what an impressive gathering SIETAR Europa is. We arranged this webinar very well in advance. I think it was nearly a year ago that we agreed, and at that time I was still in China. I'm delighted that I'm not in China at the moment because it is 1 a.m. there. So although sometimes I do keynote speeches at 1 a.m., but it is much better to speak to you from Budapest, Hungary at the moment, where it is 6 o'clock, just as I imagine in many of the places where you are. So my name is Gabor Holch indeed, and I will introduce myself a little bit more in a minute, but let me run down what I would like to do. I am bringing you a topic which is demystifying Chinese leadership style, or leadership in China, which is a topic very close to my heart. I'm going to share a little bit about the history of this topic. And then I would like to share a little bit about why the topic is important, because I think many of us are active in the intercultural field, and you probably experience it just as often as I do, that business decision makers, executives, HR managers, and so on, they put intercultural skills into the nice to have category as opposed to hardcore business skills. So I will say a couple of words about why the topic is important. Then I will introduce the methodology of approaching intercultural topics and cultural differences. And then I will apply all of this to the topic at hand, which is leadership styles in China. So I am going to follow a sequence that I like following also in my executive coaching and training work, which is starting from awareness, moving on to skills, and then finally talking about how we can turn those skills into habits. A couple of procedural issues. So Julia and the SIETAR team is already working on you being able to use the chat. So as soon as you have access to the chat, I encourage you to type your brief questions. So we already have more than 50 people in the call. So if you have a question, number one, please feel free to type it into the box while I'm speaking. I will try to speak for not more than 40 minutes, and then we still have ample time for questions at the end. But please do it while I'm speaking, because that means that when we switch to question and answer, then I already have something to work with. I can see a couple of questions and we can start right away. But please keep them brief, because if you type half a page, that's virtually a guarantee that we are not going to have the time to read it through and answer it. And I also will, since this is a fairly ambitious undertaking to summarize basically my life's work in 45 minutes, I will also bring you at the end a couple of ways to ask the questions that you couldn't ask during the webinar, see a little bit more about what I do, and keep in touch. And of course, the SIETAR team, whenever there is anything to our attention, then feel free to come in and let me know. Okay, so I will start sharing my screen right now. And okay, I hope that you can all see it. I will also do my best to monitor the chat to see if we can, if we have questions in the meantime, or God forbid, if the SIETAR team wants to get in touch with me. So demystifying China's leadership culture. And then let me first tell you why I am the one who's delivering this webinar. Many of you on the call are intercultural experts yourself. So a little bit about my background. I am an intercultural leadership consultant based in China for the last 20 years, as the introduction already said. And when I give you a little bit about my background, when I mention websites, then I include these QR codes in case you want to check those websites right away. Like this is the great difference between webinars and live events. So feel free to go ahead and check them. But also, SIETAR and myself will be happy to share this slideshow with you in PDF format after the webinar. So if you need it, just let us know. I was born in Budapest, Hungary. I spent some of my childhood in the Middle East as an expat kid, which is probably the most important source of my interest in intercultural affairs. So my friend Wei Rong Li would call me a third culture kid. I studied languages, philosophy, and then eventually in my graduate studies, I studied international relations and diplomacy. And from the very beginning of my graduate studies, actually, even in my undergraduate studies, I focused on East-West relations, which started with the East Asia policy and East Asia relations of the European Union, but then kind of got extended. And right now, most of the time as a consultant, I am working with the leadership of Western, meaning American, European, also to some extent Australian multinational companies with a presence in East Asia. And the stories that I will include in my presentation will tell you a little bit more about what I do. I left an international organization specialized in development programs where I worked as a junior diplomat. In 2002, I moved to China, started my consultancy in 2005, and very soon I found myself training and coaching and advising both Western executives who work with East Asia and also East Asian executives who are promoted to international positions in Western multinational companies. So basically, it's a beautiful intercultural story that I have the pleasure of experiencing from both directions, basically. Why does this matter? I mean, many of us are keeping in touch with hard-nosed business people who say, well, you know, this is great. Why should I care about intercultural relations? And first of all, let me look at the big picture, and then let's look at China. The first thing is a little bit of a dirty secret of multinational companies is that about a third of expatriate assignments, so basically when they send managers or experts from one country to another, basically fail, which means that the company either has to prematurely terminate the assignment or they have to rewrite the job description of the person they sent abroad. And most of the time, the primary reason is the insufficient cultural adjustment of the expat and or of the family. So it's very important that to mention that, for example, if the expatriate's kids or spouse cannot adjust properly to the country, that can wreck an intercultural and international assignment as well. So this is already, this can cost lots and lots of money for the companies. I mean, we are talking millions of dollars in case they have to relocate families and so on. So this is one. Let's look at China specifically. China has never been an easy place to do business, but in recent years, and this is something I can testify from personal experience, it is getting harder. You know, China used to be a fairly loosely regulated place to do business in, which is great for business people. And on one hand, the regulatory environment has become more mature, but also on the other hand, China is trying to be more and more self-reliant in terms of technology, in terms of research and development, even in terms of resources, which means that the playing ground for multinational companies and international SMEs, startups and medium-sized companies is kind of shrinking. So we are dealing with a situation where companies that usually have something like a 30% chance of failing in a multinational assignment are doing business in a fairly risky, a fairly volatile environment in China. And then I think you will agree with me, although I will say more about this, that this makes it extremely important to understand the leadership environment that these multinational companies in China are operating in. Now, what is culture? Why does it matter? And how do we approach it? In order to start discussing this, and now we are still in the awareness phase of the presentation, I would like to invite you to a quick exercise. And the beginning of the quick exercise, and I apologize to those who hate this kind of beginning to an exercise, is may I ask you to close your eyes? Close your eyes. I mean, it's good for you anyway not to stare at the screen all day, but this is the way that you are going to be able to do this exercise with me. So please just relax, listen to my voice, close your eyes, and the exercise is going to be a mental one. So I don't know if your eyes are closed, but if they are, keep them closed and imagine a map of the world. Please imagine the picture on a mental screen of a map of the world. Try to imagine it as vividly as you can, with the colors, with the lines, with the size, with the directions. You can even imagine where it is. Is it hanging on the wall, or is it printed in a book? Now, depending on where you come from, the map that you see in front of your mental eyes, and now you can open your eyes, it can look something like this, like the map of the world that I took from an onboard magazine of Lufthansa when I was once flying from Shanghai to Frankfurt. And this is the map of the world as many of us were grown up with. But if you come from a different culture, then the map that you imagined in front of your eyes could be something like this, which I took from an onboard magazine of China Eastern Airlines from Shanghai to Sydney. And it could be something completely different, because what the center of the world is, it very much depends on which culture you come from. And obviously the world in reality has no center, because it's a globe, it's a ball, but it is very important where we basically put the middle line based on our culture. And this is a strong message, because I will talk about different approaches to culture, and one of them is that we all see the same reality, but we express ourselves in different ways. And then, you know, one of the very popular ways to approach it is direct and indirect communication, meaning basically if somebody gives me a recommendation or a request and I want to say no, then there are those cultures which say no directly, and then there are those cultures who say no indirectly, meaning saying something like, I will think about it, or I hear what you're saying, but actually it means no. But the message that I'm trying to bring to you is it's a little bit deeper than that. Actually, your culture also defines not only what you say about what you see, but what you see. So when we do intercultural leadership workshops, then we do an exercise which is actually called Say What You See. And we use images like the ones you can see on the left side of this slide. And the important thing is that culture communicates with us in very, very subtle ways. If we were in a 1 or 2 day leadership workshop, then we would unpack these pictures a little bit. We are not going to do that because we have a little bit of time pressure here. But if you look at these pictures, some of these, you know what they are and what they mean and why they are important to you. And some of these pictures, you don't know what they mean, but believe me, they definitely mean something. So we could talk 10 minutes about each of these pictures. And indeed, that is something that we do at the intercultural leadership workshops. And then we learn about, you know, how what we see, depending on our culture, doesn't only tell us what this is in the picture, but what we do about it. So each of these pictures actually represents certain values behind them. And these values, they tell us to always tell the truth, or to expect the best following year, or to work hard because we will be rewarded, or to be tolerant to other people's difference. And then at this point, those hard-nosed business people are going to say, oh, you know, but I am so glad that I don't have to deal with this stuff. Because I am dealing with business strategy, I recruit for a living, I do the financial aspect of businesses. I am a lawyer, I deal with compliance, I deal with sales. But a very important message here is actually each of these paradigms, including stakeholder relations, including what a company wants to pass down to the next generation, all of these are expressions of cultural values. So basically in strategy, do you go for high risk or low risk? Do you want to survive or do you want to thrive? In human resources, Is it okay to hire your cousin if you are in a position to hire people? In investment, where does how do you say, being smart and being a criminal begin? The law, is everybody equal in front of the law? Men and women, young and old, people of different religions. Compliance, again, how much flexibility we have in terms of compliance. Sales and marketing in languages when you can address people in a more polite way and a less polite way. Which way do you address your prospective buyers on a billboard? Do you use the language for a family? Do you use the language for a colleague? Stakeholder relations. I mean, when, let's say, you have a quality problem with your merchandise, do you fix the quality or do you fix the person? Do you invite people out for drinks or for a dinner, or do you just talk business and try to objectively solve the issue? And what we don't do in these situations is decide who is right. So, for example, if you see that picture up there, that red picture, what does it mean? One person sees one thing, another person sees another thing. It doesn't make really too much sense to see who's right, even if one person knows exactly which cultural paradigm this picture comes from, because as soon as we say one of them is right and the other one is wrong, then immediately we lose a lot of opportunities to go deeper and interact with these people. So this is one of the reasons why I actually I'm quite uncomfortable with the kind of cultural comparisons like the one you see at the bottom and the right. Let's say direct and indirect communication. One culture is straightforward, the other one is a kind of squiggle. I don't really agree with that, because when we deliver the workshops, and you can see the same kind of pictures here on the wall, one of the messages is that different cultural paradigms are not like a straight line and a squiggle. They're a little bit more like flight paths on a globe. When, if you look at these different flight paths, obviously all of them are curved, but if you fly, then you assume that you fly in a straight line, but all the other flight paths are curved. And if you fly from the other path, of course, you see the first one is curved and yours is straight. And unfortunately, this is the way human communication and human cultures work. So if you come from an indirect culture, then you think that indirect communication is much more straightforward and much more efficient than the kind of communication that we call direct. So, for example, East Asian managers from Japan, from China, they very often tell me how much time Westerners waste by being straightforward, creating a lot of conflict of opinions and having to sort out those conflict of opinions, having to go back to principles, to the big picture, and then arriving at a consensus afterwards, rather than indirect communication. When people read between the lines, they understand what hasn't been said, and this way they save time. Now, if you come from a more direct culture, this makes absolutely no sense to you, but again, that's fine, because the confusion starts when we jump back and forth between cultural paradigms. Why is this relevant for working with China? It is because there are a couple of different cultural paradigms that guide our understanding of working with China. And these are the kind of things that you can read in books on Chinese leadership. And I'm almost sure if you have ever opened a book about doing business in China, leading in China, negotiating in China, selling in China, they started selling you one of these, I would freely call them stereotypes. So, you know, Confucian values, Sun Tzu's Art of War, a book that was written about 2,000 years ago. Well, Lao Tzu and Taoism, you know, when I was a university student, it was very much in vogue. Now, not so much. And most people focus on Confucianism. And then comes all the values that China picked up with communism, revolution, class struggle, straightforward, dynamic development paths, not being afraid of conflict, not being afraid of risk. And then comes capitalism with reform and opening up, when you turn this kind of straightforward, risk-taking attitude to making money. And then we are almost coming full circle when China recently revived values such as harmony and collectivism. I'm using these two words because in China, you hear harmony more, and in the West, you hear collectivism more when describing China. And finally, China going global and China reaching out to the rest of the world in things like the Belt and Road Program and similar ones. But we have to be very careful, because when you read about these things, then you will see a tendency to just use one of these paradigms and trying to explain everything with that one. So the book, which is about China is Confucian, it tries to explain everything with Confucian values. The book that you read about China kind of transitioning from communism to capitalism, it will explain almost everything and every interaction with that kind of value shift. But what I will show you is that just like the flight paths that I showed you, not only between cultures, but also within societies, these several cultural value systems exist side by side, and they can have parallel effect on the way that we do business with China and with individual Chinese people. So how do we turn something that is kind of mysterious and a little bit confusing into something measurable and something that we can even share objectively with others? In other words, what is the methodology of demystification? Now, apart from this quote of culture is basically making people tolerable to each other, so that we stop ourselves from basically grabbing what we want, but we also stop ourselves from just favoring our or our relatives or the people we love over everybody else. And for the last at least 2,000 years, at least in the Western world, but to some extent in the Eastern world as well, we have expressed this with the human dilemma over control and relationship. And if you have young kids in the family, then you know how strong this dilemma can be. So basically, when you're I don't know, when you want to make your kids study, or you're an aunt and you want to make your niece or nephew eat their food, there are basically these two things, these two criteria. You want to make the kids healthy and successful, productive in another way, and you also want to make the kids happy and basically you want to make them like you. And I think half of the time we can get both, and we can get a win-win solution, but sometimes we have to choose. We are liked, or we are getting the results that we want. And this dilemma and this kind of 2x2 matrix, you cannot stay in the same room with a consultant too long before the consultant hits you with a 2x2 matrix. This has come out in many different ways. Carl Gustav Jung's 4 personality types, and then assessment systems like MBTI and DISC and predictive index and more. And also very, very relevantly to our today's topic, culture maps like Erin Meyer's culture map and the global DISC system being the 2 favorites that I usually use. So if you look at all the culture mapping systems in the world, they usually follow the original Carl Gustav Jung system of behavioral models. I'm not going to run through the 4 behavioral, not types, but the 4 behavioral styles. Let me just tell you very quickly that the colors are very eloquent. So basically, red, high risk, very determined, result orientated, can you a little bit bullish. Yellow, fun, visionary, flexible. Green, service style, kind, empathy, good listener, good team worker. And blue being planning and implementation, reducing risk, being consistent. So both the culture maps that I'm showing you on the right side, basically the best known culture map in the world, Erin Meyer's culture map, and on the right side, and on the left side, the so-called global DISC system, which uses the exact same underlying system. It just graphically, it presents it in a different way. Usually, when somebody knows anything about these culture mapping systems, then they know that they can compare countries. But very often it happens that we have a wonderful tool with 200 different functions, and we only use 5 of those functions. And this is definitely one of those examples, because if we only use culture maps to compare countries with each other, we are seriously underutilizing this amazing tool. So I will run through how culture maps can help us, not just to profile countries, but also subcultures within countries, corporate cultures, and even individual behavior, and how we use this to demystify Chinese leadership culture. So I will always mention specifically China. Now, if you look at these two culture maps, in both cases, you will see China either in the green corner, so basically the people-centered and responsive as opposed to proactive, if you want, introverted corner, or somewhere in between the green and the blue corner. So let's say 2/3 green and 1/3 blue. And that is based on research data that was collected originally by Gerd Hofstede, the World Values Survey, and lots of others, and then now being used by researchers worldwide. So let's look very quickly at mapping cultures and subcultures. So first of all, in the case of many countries, and China is no exception, there is some controversy between researchers about where they place a country exactly. But usually China is placed in the lower right corner, which basically means in DISC, the DIS, service style, the green style. Now, the interesting thing is that this gives us two dilemmas. So first of all, it happens to me countless times that a Western multinational starts working together with China. And God forbid, they promote a Chinese manager whose performance was good enough into an international position. And then this Chinese manager either starts managing international managers in turn, or comes to the Western headquarters and starts a job as an international manager there. And then at that point, the HR director or the COO or whoever is in charge calls me and says, Gabor, we are really confused because, you know, we read these books about the Chinese Confucian values of harmony and teamwork and sacrificing your own opinion for the common good. But this woman or this man doesn't seem to be a typical Chinese manager at all. You know, they are straightforward, they are result-oriented, they are extremely ambitious, they raise their voice if they don't like something. So how is this possible? And the way it is possible is, and then when this happens, then people start questioning, is China really a harmonious society? Is China really following Confucian values? Now, the interesting thing is that as far as the statistical average is concerned, yes, China is a country where people are quite worried, are quite uneasy about challenging each other. It is a society where usually people are supposed to put the common good first. However, imagine that if you look at Erin Meyer's culture map, take each flag, blow it up, magnify it, and then cut it down into 4 again, and then create another culture map within that little flag. And within China, you would have the 4 cultural styles as well. But China is not unique in this sense. You could play the same game with Brazil, Italy, Spain, and even Hungary or the Netherlands, even though those are very small countries. So what is happening within these little icons, and how can we understand it? Now, if you look at the dynamics of international business in China, all the foreigners who ever worked in China, lived in China, or visited in China. So just imagine that we have the statistics at hand. And if you go through the statistics, you will see that over 90% of those foreigners who visited China on tourism, on business, or lived in China as students, as artists, as startup owners, as multinational executives, and so on, over 90% stayed in the top 10 cities of China. So these are big hubs like Beijing, Tianjin, Shanghai, Nanjing, Ningbo, Chongqing, what we call Canton, or in Chinese, Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and I'm excluding Hong Kong for this comparison. So 90% of the foreigners experienced not mainstream China, but these cities. And what you have to know is these cities are, number one, much more exposed to the outside world than other cities because they are hosting so-called special development zones. So it's much easier for foreign businesses and individual foreigners to enter these places. And then secondly, for at least 100 years, but I would argue that for 300 years, these cities have been a collection of one generation after another of high-risk minded, ambitious Chinese people. That means that when you experience the environment, in the business environment, the leadership environment in these cities, you do not experience mainstream China as it is. You know this if you are a foreigner and you worked in China in industries such as agriculture or academia, for example. You worked for a charitable organization or an international organization like the United Nations, and you went to smaller cities or went to the countryside and talked to people there. Large cities in China are as far away in mentality from mainstream China as foreign countries. And my wife is Chinese, and I have relatives who live in small cities, and they think Shanghai people are just as crazy as foreigners. So basically what you can see on the left side is, imagine, I always say when I teach this stuff at university, I always tell young people that they can imagine China as a Christmas tree. So it's a big green triangle where it means population statistics, and the higher you go, the more power and the more money people have. And then up there is a lot of red. Down there is a lot of green with red patches here and there. So basically, if you talk to somebody in the Communist Party, if you talk to somebody who works for a multinational company or manager in a state-owned enterprise, or somebody who is a very successful artist or startup owner, they are tough. They know what they want, and they are not afraid to take risks. And one of my favorite illustrations about this, why is it that affluent Chinese people like sending their kids to study in the United States? You know, this is something that was really not typical, let's say, in my youth, of leaders and successful people in the Soviet Union. And that's because these families, including Communist Party leaders, they want to teach their kids to be winners, not great team players and obedient Confucian citizens. So already we are kind of nuancing the picture. And I can see that in the meantime, the SIETAR team managed to sort out the chats. So please feel free to type your questions into the box. Just please be brief. The briefer you are, the easier it is for us to monitor your questions. And I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 more slides, and then we are going to switch into discussion mode. I'm aware that I'm going fast, but that's because I'm really, really curious about your reflection on all of this. So I think this is a very important part of demystification. So if you ever prepare yourself to work in China or prepare others for working in China, and they are not Chinese themselves, please know that they have a 90% chance of having to accommodate themselves to the culture of these big Chinese successful population centers, rather than mainstream China, so to speak. It doesn't mean China is not Confucian. It doesn't mean China is not harmonious. It means that these pockets of result-orientated, successful-mindedness are quite different. And then let's look at corporate cultures, because of course, most of the people that we are talking about here, expats, business visitors, or even people who connect with China virtually over Zoom calls or MS Teams meetings, they are going to connect one company to the other company. And this can, again, modify the picture very much, because it's definitely not the same story if you work for, and I'm going to follow disk colors, if you work in the red corner and you, let's say, work for General Electric China, or you work in the yellow corner and you work for Apple, or you work in the green corner and, let's say, you work for an extremely service-minded company like a healthcare provider, or you work in the blue corner and, let's say, you work for BMW. Because when you go and live in China and work in China for a couple of years, or go there on a brief visit, you are going to be surrounded by the people who are only acculturated to that corporate culture. So they are not Chinese people in general. They are not even typical Shanghai people or Beijing people. They are GE China people or BMW China people, and that can be extremely important. One of my big clients has been IKEA, and then wherever you go in the world, including China, and I lived very, very close to IKEA when I trained some of their HR managers. I just had to basically go to the other side of the road. Then once you step into IKEA, you are basically in a Nordic green style culture. So that means that attracts people who are naturally like that. I very often like to say that people don't choose jobs, jobs choose people. Now, and if somebody is naturally by personal temperament attracted to a more hawkish cultures, then maybe they will find themselves working for like BlackRock China or General Electric China. I lined up also a number of Chinese companies because it's not only about multinationals, it's also Chinese companies who express this kind of diversity within Chinese society. So if you look at companies that were either started in the north of China in Beijing or in the conglomerate that is Guangzhou and Shenzhen, where a lot of people are self-made startup people, you will find a lot of companies that come from the kind of high risk, high yield red culture style. Whereas if you look at service companies like Alibaba, then they deal with the market with more empathy, with more service mindedness. You have the very, how do you say, I would say very technology minded, a little bit nerdish companies like Tencent. And interestingly, it's the yellow, is the fun corner, which is underrepresented in China. And many of the companies that had a disruptive, visionary business culture and business plan, many of them went bust recently in China. And one of the examples is Ofo, the bike sharing company. I would be very happy to hear your opinion about this. But let's go a little bit further and let's look at individual behavior. So a very important thing, and this is one of the biggest mistakes that I can see when people work with culture mapping methodologies, is that they simply forget to take individual temperament into consideration. So when they send somebody, let's say to China to work with Chinese leaders, then they look at their home culture. If the person is Israeli, then they make an analytical comparison between Israeli mainstream culture and Chinese business culture. Somebody goes over there from Brazil, then they see what is the level of culture shock between Brazil and China. But about half of the people from any given culture are not typical representative of their culture. So we have to profile the individual candidate. We have to place them into a culture map, which is something that we can do. I will show you a picture about that, and see the level of culture shock based on individual temperament. And just because somebody is Chinese, there is no guarantee that they are typical Chinese. And just because somebody is Italian, there is no guarantee that they are typical Italian. I mean, the HR people who make these decisions themselves are not to blame. Basically, we went a little bit sideways with the Gerd Hofstede system, which could only compare cultures, countries, and not individuals. So what does it mean in practical terms for you and me? I tried to be as practical as I could. So I will just read these out and then we can start our discussion. And I'm very happy to see that I already have material in the chat box. Don't plan for mainstream China culture. So don't prepare your people for working with China. The mainstream Chinese culture. Prepare them for working in that specific city, in that specific company, based on their specific natural work style. Subcultures within countries. 90% of foreigners work in the disc red, affluent, assertive segment of China, the winners of Chinese society, basically. So don't expect Taoists and Confucians. I think this is a very important part. Look at what you can expect, not just based on the country, the place, the city, but also, for example, do they work in this or that industry? Which multinational company we are talking about? Because multinational companies have a tendency to attract people whose temperament is suitable for that corporate culture. It's simple Darwinian selection. Basically, you join a company, you hate the environment, you will find another company for yourself. corporate cultures, inconsistently is the only bad strategy. So there is, if you look at the different disc styles, we can also turn them into intercultural strategies. Let's say, do we push through? If, let's say, the compliance standards in the local culture and our own culture are different, do we push through our own compliance standards, or do we try to adopt the local compliance standards? There is no bad strategy. You can be flexible or you can be inflexible. Both of them work as long as you're consistent, because eventually the environment will get used to how you make decisions if you are consistent. But if you want to be consistent, please make everyone mindful of your corporate values. Like IKEA makes it very, very clear, from the environment, the furniture, to the way people talk to each other, all the documents, very, very consistent. The same in BlackRock. And you will immediately notice the difference between the two cultures if you spend 1 hour with them, and reflect them in all aspects of business. So the ones that I listed: HR, finance, compliance, sales, etc. Do you want to be fun and high risk? Then what does a fun and high risk job interview look like? What does a fun and high risk investment strategy look like, etc.? And finally, individual behavior. Don't search or train for culture fit with China. Assess individual work style and align with the specific environment of each assignment. So demystifying Chinese leadership culture. You don't know exactly who is on the other side. It could be somebody who is a good fit for your idea of, let's say, Confucian values or collectivist values. If this person is somebody in, let's say, a state-owned company in Nanjing who used to be an agriculture professor in a university in a small town, he could be your absolutely ideal example of a Confucian scholar. But then you go to another place, and then you meet a self-made millionaire who is running the local business unit of a multinational company in Chongqing, and then suddenly all your Confucian values go out of the window. And the more agile you are of reading body language and finding out, okay, this person is much closer to, let's say, the high-risk, high-authority value system of the Communist Party, or of Wall Street, or, I don't know, of Apple. Okay, a couple of resources, and then I will look at the questions. So first of all, I went fast, and I also told you briefly that you can place individual candidates' assessment profiles into culture maps. If you're curious about this, just look at my full name, find me on YouTube, and there is a video I put online yesterday about how to use culture maps for practical HR-related decision-making. And I look forward to questions as well about this. I would also like to tell you that much of what I shared with you right now, it comes from 5 years of interviews that I did for a book that is going to be published next year. So if you want to go a little bit deeper into the life stories of foreign executives working in China and Chinese executives promoted to international positions in Western companies, then follow this page, and then you will be able to see the book bloom from an idea into an actual book. Thanks mainly to Business Expert Press in New York, who are going to publish the book next year. But also you can see free chapters and videos and articles that I write on the journey of the books. We are also going to video interview managers who appeared in the book. And then finally, and this is the slide that I will leave on while we do the discussion, if you want to get in touch with me, I think you would be interested in either of these. The QR code is for the blog site, but in each of the websites, the last tab is contact. And if you write something there, then I will get it as an email. And now I will go back and I can see that, oh gosh, it's really great. So thank you very much for all of you who typed in where you are from. And I will just read it out, and I will get a little bit of help in case I forget anything very important. I lived in Changchun in the northeast, where there is a big Volkswagen factory. One day, a German told me that Chinese will only help their friends and Chinese friend complained that Germans won't even help a friend. Yeah, that is. How important is Guangxi? I personally don't really like Guangxi because in the Chinese language, Guangxi means a very deep kind of relationship, which foreigners will find very, very difficult to develop. If you went back 100 years in China, then in the old times, Guangxi would have meant that you are basically a family relation, or you were born in the same city, or you were born in the same clan. And also, staying on the awareness level, I also like reminding people, especially executives that I coach, is that it's part of human nature to just too easily blame cultural differences, right? So let's say I am a German manager. I'm working in China. I don't speak the language. I don't know the legal system. I don't know the financial system. I cannot even have the goddamn electricity connected to my factory, and I'm very, very upset. And then I raise my voice a little bit, and I'm impatient, and maybe I make a couple of mistakes, and my Chinese colleagues give me resistance. It's human nature to immediately blame cultural differences. Yes, they ostracize me because I'm German. But very often, we can actually solve these problems just by breathing and opening up a little bit to the other side. And maybe they are not angry with me because I'm German, but because I'm impatient and I'm a little bit arrogant. Of course, it can happen that it's cultural difference. In my opinion, it's half-half. But then also I can build awareness of where the differences are. And culture maps really help in this. And then culture maps are really good because they are a coordinate system. So if I see where the differences are, then I can see what I need to add. Take away a little bit of authority, add a little bit of empathy. And then you can turn this into communication. Okay, Andrea, German, worked and studied in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and Guangzhou. Okay, good. People have China experience. Do you see that civil servants and government officials in China have a more standardized way of behaving and doing across the whole country compared with semi-private and private business? Yes. The reason for that is that if you step out of line, if you, experiment, if you disrupt as a civil servant in China, you are taking a much bigger personal risk than if you do this as an entrepreneur or a corporate executive. So this is the reason again. Now, we are going around and around in circles. So people immediately don't start behaving like that because they are civil servants. In fact, if you go to some special economic or development zones, if you go to a place like Shenzhen, where everybody is young and the city itself is new, you can see that civil servants are also more flexible. But eventually you have to imagine, and many of my Chinese friends walked in these shoes, is that people who go and do a stint, let's say after corporate, as a civil servant, if they like this stable and predictable environment, they stay. And if they hate this environment, then they will move on and go back to corporate. So eventually, this is going to be a self-reinforcing environment, and this is how all environments work. So especially if you go to places with considerable traditions like Beijing or Nanjing or Shanghai, you will see that yes, civil servants are much more low-key and much more predictable. Are people-oriented profiles better in adapting to the other culture? Well, if you go to another country on business, your goal is not just adaptation, because you also have to get results, and you can easily run out of time. So, if you're a student in a foreign country, I would say that the goal of learning intercultural skills is primarily about not creating too much conflict and blending in. But if you go to another country on business, that's not enough, because the more you blend in, the less you are needed. If you want to start acting like a Chinese person, China has enough Chinese people, so why do they need you? Actually, most of the very successful entrepreneurs and executives from another country in China, they are successful exactly because they do things in a different way. So I would say if you are a people-oriented person, you have an advantage because you can read body language, you can use empathy to feel when the other side is upset with you or doesn't agree with you. Use that, but don't forget that you are there to do business and get results. Good. Let's go on. I hope it's enough if I touch on each question briefly, because I'm trying to cover as many questions as possible. Okay. Given that Shalom Schwartz's work covers both individual as well as national culture level and has synergies with the two axes you have shown, have you incorporated his work in all of in your analysis? No, I am making a screenshot right now, and I am going to look this up right away. And if you have a little bit more information, or if you actually know somebody who does this research personally, I would be very grateful if you could use one of these websites to drop me a line. Any advice to work with Chinese students? Yes, especially if you worked with non-Chinese students before, and the more Western you are, the more this is going to be true. But also if you are, let's say, come from Middle East or certain a little bit more assertive Asian cultures. Chinese students are acculturated to respect authority and not to think too deeply about, what they want to get out of their studies. A lot of Chinese students, they choose their major based on the preferences of the family. They are actually amazingly smart and very, very hardworking, but the engine doesn't always have the steering behind it. So they can go very fast and in a very determined manner, but they will rely on their professors and mentors for where they want to get with their studies. Could you share a favorite exercise or activity that you use for training for Western expatriates working in a Chinese company, for example? Well, I have a great icebreaker, which I also included in my book, which is called China in One Word. So one of the problems with China is that people have very judgmental opinions about it, mainly because we have such an information shortage, but they are afraid to talk about it. So there is a famous Chinese writer called Yu Hua, and he wrote this book, China in 10 Words. And I just turned it into an activity. And I said, whether you have been in China or not, whether you know anybody from China or not, tell me one word that summarizes your concept of China. And I asked people to write it down and not to think too much, be spontaneous. And then we start discussing these words, preferably without any bias. So if somebody writes something terrible or very judgmental, let's just breathe and let's unpack it and let's see why they think like that, because usually they have a reason. Bill says, thanks for a presentation. Thank you for the thank you. What I missed is any comment on the need for cultural self-awareness rather than memorizing DISC and Maya. Is that not important? It's absolutely important. Actually, if you go to any of these websites or you go to my videos, one of the things that I keep recommending is that you do the DISC yourself so that you can place yourself in the culture map. So naturally, for example, I'm a horrible fit for China because I'm an I style. I'm a very, very heavy, more than 70% I style. So theoretically, I'm a bad fit for China, but Shanghai is one of the funnest places in China. And my profession is one of the funnest professions that you can do in China. So ultimately, if you follow my advice and you look at the culture fit, not just in terms of which country you are going to be in, but which city and which profession you are in, then again, I'm a good fit. But you're perfectly right. You have to build awareness about your own natural cultural style first and how it differs from the cultural profile of your home country. That's extremely important, but I kind of thought I implied that, but probably I didn't make it explicit enough. For friends in China, what is your WeChat? Just contact me in any other way, because I'm not really, really good at using WeChat apart from family. I get many, many messages with family. Okay, I think we have time for a couple more questions. Molly says, individual cultures are important just as understanding context. But how do you explain the red line that does exist in China, for example, respecting authority and hierarchy? This is part and parcel of Confucianism. It's not a myth. This is always confirmed by Chinese themselves, as well as other Asians I work with. Okay, so you have to be careful with here, because first of all, Chinese people have a less clear understanding of Confucianism than you would expect. This is number one. And number two, in heavily top-down systems, like China has been for the last couple of decades, people tend to respect authority because if they don't, the consequences can be quite severe. So just because you see somebody who has high respect of authority and fairly obedient, you cannot immediately tell is because they are working on a very authoritarian top-down system and they respect authority because or else, or because they naturally work in a system where authority is based on dignity, for example, like the classic Confucian system. If you want to understand the difference, I would very much encourage you to do either of two things. Either, if you like this kind of stuff, then read Bertrand Russell's 1932 book, The Problem of China. It's historical and it's not an easy reading, but it's amazing. Or go to my website, HOLCH. Sorry, actually, I made a mistake here. Forget about HOLCHHU. I will stop sharing my screen. So go to HOLCH.biz. I made a mistake there. And then you will see reading and choose the book Management and Leadership in China. And that is an excellent book on the difference between traditional Chinese leadership culture and modern Chinese leadership culture. There is a huge difference there. But when you visit a Chinese multinational company or a Chinese state-owned company, and they say, you know, these typical Confucian Chinese companies like China Mobile and Bank of China, no, actually, the leadership system there is really, really not Confucian. It is top-down, it is based on authority, but it's not Confucian. I used to teach intercultural communication at a German university where half of the student body is Chinese. One of the biggest challenges was to get them to be more expressive, that is, to speak in class. Group work was okay. Other ideas, no. Westerners, we have very little patience to make Asians speak, not just Chinese, Koreans and Japanese as well. So the way I like doing it is two tips. One of them is give people time to think. So give them 5 minutes to write down what they want to say afterwards. Because in communication, Chinese people are not risk takers. They learned that if they say the wrong thing, they can be easily punished. And then afterwards, when you gave people time to make up their minds and maybe write down what they want to say, I would put them in small groups, let's say 3 people, maximum 4 people, and make them discuss, come up with conclusions, and then they can share those conclusions, but they don't have to tell the professor or the trainer whose conclusions they were. And in this way, you can reduce the risk of speaking up. This is the way I like to approach this. Okay, I will go on to Ralph. Dear Gabor, thank you very much. Oh, okay, thank you very much. This means a lot to me, and especially because we are towards the end of this presentation. Can you please write the author's name? I don't know which author it is, but if you go to holch.biz and you go to reading, you will find all of these books there. And do we have time for one more, or do we have to leave?
No.
One more. Okay.
Fine. Yeah.
So okay, there is one, Foundations of Learning. Yes, these are just recommendations. And Fishbowl, I didn't have a good experience with Fishbowl in Asia. I didn't have an as a reminder. The Fishbowl is the kind of exercise where let's say the trainer is in front, or somebody who's doing a role play is in front, and everybody else is listening. But one other thing is that in East Asian groups, once you use Fishbowl, then individual responsibility to share kind of tends to dwindle. So you can lose those participants who are not very happy to be in the workshop, or they think they have something better to do. So the phones come out very easily, or an individual, a pair discussion starts somewhere at the back of the room. So the kind of, if you know the methodology called tribal leadership, that you start with individuals, then you put them into triangles or quadrants, and then then you build up larger teams. That is the methodology that always worked for me with not just East Asia. I did a lot of work with Vietnam, Thailand, Korea, Japan. It seems to work everywhere. You will also find the book Tribal Leadership on my website. Julia, I think we are done.
I think we are. There are more questions popping up, but as you mentioned, they can always reach you and go on with the questions. It was very inspiring. Luckily, we could enable the chat. So thank you everybody for your patience. But I think the questions were quite meaningful, and big applaud for your expertise. I just, was listening, know what you were saying. So all of you that want to reach Gabor again, Gabor is willing to share his slides and his contact details. So please go on asking questions. For now,
absolutely, and I will just quickly share a couple of links because I made one typo there, and I will also share my the address of my YouTube channel, because that's another. I mean, if you wish you could continue this topic today, then you can just go to the YouTube channel, and the latest video is an exact continuation of what we are doing now.
I think, Gabor, if you agree, we could go on a part 2 of this webinar next year.
I would be delighted. I would be absolutely delighted.
Yeah. Because I say
and then maybe what I can do is I can bring less content and we can allow more discussion. I would really love to hear. Just I had a little sampler of how this comes across from you. I mean, plural you, everybody's experience, and SIETAR is always a gathering of people who have so much experience in such a diverse range of countries and cultures. I'm fascinated about that.
Okay, so there is a follow-up according to Gabor, so we will see to his availability in 2023. So keep tuned and have a lovely evening. Thank you so much, Gabor.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me here.
Digital applause for you.
Thank you.
And all of you have a lovely evening.
Wherever you are, yes, have fun, and we will see you very soon. Thank you very much.